Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name's Alex Lynn-Ferner, and I am a National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences postdoctoral fellow. I'm hosted by the Saatchi Chair in Identities and Social Cohesion in Africa, in conjunction with the Department of Development Studies at Nelson Mandela University. And it's good to welcome you all to this seminar series titled Everything is Energy. And we're very lucky to be joined today by Professor Janet Cherry. Janet Cherry is a South African activist and academic who's currently Professor of Development Studies at the Nelson Mandela University in Quebec. So Janet is lead researcher, among many other things, is lead researcher in the Transition Township project, which is exploring community-owned renewable energy, circular economy, and food sovereignty in South Africa's townships. And in fact, it was that work that really attracted me to being a postdoc at Nelson Mandela University on a more personal note. And Prof. Cherry has students from across Southern Africa working on exciting topics like conservation, agriculture, land tenure, food sovereignty, just transition from fossil fuels, among other things. And her current research project is entitled Emancipatory Scholarship, Meeting the Challenge of Climate Change in Southern Africa through Piloting Alternative Development Strategies for the Region. So today's talk, Janet is going to be speaking to us about core, SOAR, or socialism. And core or SOAR is not some sort of infection. It's about community-owned renewable energy and socially owned renewable energy, and discussing the question of realizing the just energy transition through new forms of ownership. So Janet, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And good morning, everybody. And just to say, before I start the slideshow, that I've given versions of this presentation on this project to a number of different institutions, universities, and organizations. But what has changed is that we are now working on a project for the Presidential Climate Commission, and it is on models of social ownership of renewable energy. So I'm really interested in getting feedback on the model that I'm going to present to you today. And I'm doing so in a spirit of open criticism and inviting people to really interrogate this model and whether it is viable and how we can use it. So let me put up my slideshow. Okay, just tell me if you can see it.
You can see it, but it's in it's sort of in the PowerPoint view rather than the slideshow view. So you might just need to press the little button that starts it as a slideshow. There we are.
Okay, so I've called this presentation Realizing the Just Transition Through New Forms of Ownership, a very tentative contribution to the energy democracy debate. And I'll go through, firstly, some of the contested concepts that we're looking at. So we're doing a project on social ownership, models or forms of social ownership. And we are limiting it. We are talking about social ownership as involving somewhere between public and private. Okay, so it's not concerned with business, formal businesses or private ownership, and it's not concerned with municipalities and Eskom. We're looking at something in between. Yeah. Community, South Africa, it's a much abused word, but it's used contextually to mean poor communities. People don't like using the word poor. Black communities, township communities, working class communities. We're not looking at community in the general sense, so we're not looking at wealthy members of a Gulf estate who form a community, or the Zionist community, which can be called communities. We're looking at, in the South African context, how we define community. So just bear with me as we talk about it, but we're talking about a local or locality, which is a geographically defined place where people live. And we're talking about a poor or working class place in this context. So it could be a village, it could be a rural village, it could be an informal settlement. But in this context, in this particular pilot project, we're talking about a formal township. And then the other concept is a cooperative. We're talking here about cooperatives which are functioning in a particular way, as is understood within the more, I would say, within the socialist tradition of cooperatives, which is really worker ownership and worker control of cooperatives, equal membership, and a principle of egalitarian ownership. There are many cooperatives which don't work on these principles, and we're aware of many which are in fact government funded or supported, which are not functioning in this way and which function according to other principles. But let's leave that for the moment. The main conceptual framework for this project is the just transition, and this was inspired by the COP17 meeting, which was more than 10 years ago now, 12 years ago in Durban. At the COP17 climate, what was it called? The Civil Society Forum. We were represented there through a group which is called the Nelson Mandela Bay Transition Network. And in that forum, there was the launch of the 1 million climate jobs campaign. And these kinds of slogans, you can see: cool it with people's power, a just transition to a low carbon economy to combat unemployment and climate change. This was this idea that inspired this Transition Township project. It wasn't about the transition from fossil fuel coal-fired power stations to other forms of employment for workers in those coal-fired power stations, which is obviously an important part of this 1 million climate jobs campaign. But we started interpreting this idea more broadly. So we looked at this concept of Transition Township and two transitions. The one is obviously the transition from fossil fuel. And we understand that as a deep, just transition. What does it mean? It's not only about energy. It's not only about exchanging fossil fuel with something else, with some other form of energy. It's also about food sovereignty. It's about a circular economy. It's about a more just economy. It involves agriculture, food production, construction, all different forms of that transition from fossil fuel. And it also involves essentially a transition to a more just economy, redistributive, decentralized. And we are interrogating what this means. Does this mean changes in forms of ownership? Can renewable energy, and in particular PV solar, give us the means to have a more decentralized ownership of the means of production? So in Marxist terms, this would mean a form of socialism. If ordinary people can own the means of energy production and have a decentralized system where they can do industrial production, circular economy, using renewable energy to use waste plastic to transform that into gutters for water capture, creating a circular economy based on what people need. That actually is socialism. But it's also a sustainable economy. So we're trying to integrate all these things together. But let's not be too ambitious at this stage. We're looking essentially at what is called the just energy transition. And the just energy transition, we're confining this discussion to energy. This is a seminar about energy. And we're looking at township economy. So we're not trying to address this in this pilot project at a regional level, looking at rural-urban divides and so on. We're just looking at township economy. So we've got one pilot project functioning. It's called Saltuba. It's a cooperative, 25 households in Kwazakhele, right in the center of the old formal townships of Nelson Mandela Bay, near Njoli Square. and it's in a gap tap, which is a public open space. So part of this is about people reclaiming the commons, if you like. I mean, this land is municipal land, but it is conventionally used by the households. And there are 120 of these gap taps just in Kwazakhele Township. So for about 30 households, 35 households around each gap tap. And this particular cooperative has been set up with the 25 of the households around it as members. And you can see they are doing vegetable gardening, water harvesting, and there's some other aspects of it. But the focus of it is energy. And the idea is that township households and public spaces can produce energy through PV solar in a decentralized way, which of course we know technically it can be done. They can feed it into the grid. They can actually not, the objective here is not to be independent, i.e. a sort of project of township autonomy. The objective is for them to actually create income and wealth through selling electricity. So owning the means of production and selling. So you can see when we set this up in 2019, this article by Guy Rogers says, the Kwazakhele project could be a blueprint for countrywide rollout in a win-win for all. Okay? So there was a lot of excitement about it, but unfortunately it hasn't been proven so easy to make this pilot work. So let's just interrogate for a start, when we're talking about community-owned renewable energy, which is what this is, what actually is the model of it? We're talking about an energy cooperative, but are we talking about the one model, which is to have rooftop solar, i.e. on each household? And we would say, absolutely, like every RDP house, these are not even RDP houses, these are old municipal houses from the 1950s. Every single one of them should have solar panels. Should they have a feed-in tariff? There's no feed-in tariff at the moment whereby township households can benefit from creating and selling energy. Should it be on an institution, what we would call small-scale embedded generation, where it's actually meeting the needs of those institutions like schools or churches or small businesses and so on, that they have big roofs. I mean, many of the schools, have big rooftops. We did quite a lot of baseline research to understand what is the area of roof on these institutions in Kwazakhele, how much energy could be generated if you covered them with solar panels. It's a lot of energy. Should we test that model? And then the third model is to have a freestanding solar array in a public space, which is actually owned by the cooperative. And then that would wheel energy through the municipal grid and sell it on to other buyers of energy. So that's a wheeling, I'm calling it WIT, but it's a wheeling tariff, if you like. So you would pay the municipality tariff to use their grid. However, it's the person who's buying the energy who pays the tariff. So hypothetically, if we could get this right, the cooperative would not pay the municipality anything. They would be selling the energy to another, whatever, company or something via the municipal grid, who would pay the municipality that wheeling tariff. So those are the three options. We decided, I mean, this was quite a long process, about 2 years of discussion and consultation and baseline research to test in the first pilot the third option, which was having a cooperative, 25 households, and they are then the owners and managers of this freestanding solar array. So we can go into that. Here it is. This was the first one being set up. You can see where it's situated, in these little lanes, gangs, whatever, the houses. These are the old Kwazakhele houses. And here we go. So we've got, this is set up. it was connected to the grid. It is connected to the grid. Municipal Electricity Department worked with us to do this, and they were excited about the project. They are actually still excited about it, despite the problems. But you can see this is a small grid. It was 5 kilowatts, and we did quite a lot of research estimating how much could be generated from it. So we say, okay, look, this model, how could this work on if we went to scale? What kind of contribution could it make? So here we have Kwazakhele, 25,000 households, lots of buildings, public buildings, industrial buildings next door, quite a skilled workforce, high unemployment, of course, formal housing primarily, service delivery. So people do have electricity. So don't just get it out of your heads that this is like a mini grid in a rural area where there's no electricity, etc. Everybody's got electricity. Most of the households have a municipal account and they have free basic services. So they have what they call assistance to the poor, which means that they get a certain allocation of free water and electricity. This is very important in terms of how this model is working and not working. But Patrick Brennan, who I don't know if he's on the line here, he's done some modeling of the value of the production that can come from this model. And this is actually combining household production of both energy and food. So there's considerable value that can be generated. But we're going to focus on the energy aspect of it here. So in the model, we're looking at a combination we're looking at a neighborhood production system. So Saltuba, we would consider a neighborhood cooperative. And that neighborhood could have each household could have 4 kilowatts on their roof. Plus you could have the installation, which could be actually quite a big installation, although it's small at the moment. And then that could also, also you would have people in that cooperative who would be involved with doing the maintenance and the repair and so on of that installation. Okay, so we've got a model in terms of how this could work in terms of investment and what this could generate as income. And we're saying essentially this particular model is not based on employment. It's based on production from the actual households and the public land in that area, and the ownership by households of a share in that facility. So it is actually a socialist model. So it's a cooperative ownership of the means of production, the sale of the produce, and the bringing in of income or revenue to that community from that. So there will be some jobs, small in terms of maintenance or construction and so on, but that is not the primary objective of this model. We also noted, if you look here, this gives you a sort of visual of Kwazakhele. That's the old Swartkorps coal-fired power station, which was decommissioned a couple of decades ago. And we thought it would be absolutely brilliant to repurpose that old coal-fired power station, which is not going to be used ever for electricity from coal. It's currently being used to store manganese, but actually it could be repurposed into a green production center with linking into agricultural production and renewable energy production, aquaponics, all kinds of things. In terms of energy production, what kind of contribution this model could make? We looked at the amount of energy that could be created with this model. And you'll see here right at the bottom, the Saltuba Co-op, 25 households, 0.1 megawatt installed capacity. It's small, but if you do that across Ward 22 and then across the whole of Kwazakhele, you see there's quite a a significant contribution to energy, and it has a value, a monetary value. So we're asking the critical question: who benefits from this model? Okay, and exploring these models. There are many very, I won't say very complex issues, but problems we haven't managed to resolve. The one is that the premise here is that this is a grid-tied system, and we haven't managed to get it right, because while it's been connected to the grid, actually feeding energy into the grid, municipalities been benefiting, been getting free electricity from Saltuba, but they haven't been able to be paid for it. Okay. The households, some of the households who are members of the Saltuba Cooperative, were actually told by the municipal officials that they were not allowed to have access to free basic electricity or assistance to the poor, subsidy, because they were members of a cooperative, so they were shareholders in a business, despite the fact that they hadn't received anything yet. I mean, this is absolutely shocking, you know, so we contested this, but what happened was that it threatened the cooperative because people withdrew from the cooperative. They said, we need our free basic services, so if we join a cooperative, it's going to be that we're not going to get them anymore. You know, we've got to change these policies or the way the ATTP is administered. The ATTP itself, the free basic electricity, has to be reformed because, okay, it's not just a question of how much it is. So there's an argument that it's not enough for poor households. But in fact, municipalities have abused this system. I'm not saying this municipality has, but there was a report in 2021 which outlined how municipalities are receiving the funds from National Treasury, but are not actually distributing it for free basic electricity. So that's the one thing. But people who are part of this, we said if we do this on a rooftop model on people's houses, they are going to feel threatened, i.e. that they're going to lose their free basic electricity. The municipality also feels threatened because they think that they are going to lose revenue from selling electricity. But I must just say, you know, we found a statistic the other day that household electricity use is only, what was it, only 17%. 17% household use is, and of that, I think only maybe less than a quarter of that is from township electricity use, because of course that's much lower than the wealthy or middle class areas. So just think of that. I mean, it's really how municipalities can then blame township residents for loss of revenue and be dependent on that revenue. There's something seriously wrong with that model. In terms of a contribution or in terms of a community benefit, so, you know, what happened was that because we weren't able to sell, to get a feed-in tariff from the municipality, i.e. to sell to the municipality, and we weren't able to get Saltuba to wheel the electricity through the municipal grid to a third party, we then tested out the third option, which is to have a system with a, let me show you here. We had a German project through the university who constructed this waste recycling facility, and then we set it up with a lithium-ion battery and an inverter and some lights and plugs and so on, to allow for school kids to use it, or people to use it to run an internet cafe, or whatever they wanted to use it for community projects. So that's really using that electricity generated by the solar array for people's own use. So this was what we called the Saltuba Smart Building. And as Guy Rogers noted, this was in December last year, it could offer pupils a study haven during load shedding. So that was one of the ideas. So there is some community benefit from this. Again, if it's grid tied, and we discussed this yesterday with Russell Phillips here from our renewable energy division in the Department of Physics. So, I mean, he was saying the problem is you have to do this balancing act, because if people are using the electricity for their own purposes, then you can't sell it. You know, like you have to decide whether it's going to be more viable to sell it or to use it for own benefit. So that's one of the things we're testing in this model here. But we're actually looking at the whole, in the context of the whole national power crisis, whether this can be a viable model. So it does require capital input, and it does require quite a lot of organization, because it needs a lot of capacity to establish these things. But technically, we believe it can be done. And we think the main problem is actually the regulatory framework at the moment to allow this to happen. So this gives you some figures on how much electricity could be generated. I mean, a contribution of 6 megawatts to the city is quite considerable. That's one township, eh? It's not all the township. So that was the launch in December of this new structure. We have many challenges. I mean, although the regulatory framework has changed, this should allow us to, or allow Saltuba to do wheeling. It's not able, there's no appropriate feed-in tariff for Saltuba. Saltuba is struggling to get a municipal account so that they can do get a smart meter and wheel the electricity to a third party. And we still have to test whether that is actually going to be economically viable. We have got some support from the municipality, but unfortunately, because the municipality has been so unstable, the council has changed like 4 times since we started the project. And we've presented it to a number of mayoral committees and they've supported it, and although the electricity department supports it, we haven't managed to get any mainstream support from the municipality. Yeah, and then we also tried to set up a little waste recycling thing with the Center for Community Technology here at the university, which has developed an app for waste recycling. And the idea is that the co-op members would be able to use an app or an iPad or a phone to monitor energy and waste recycling and so on. So that's in process at the moment. It's a small NRF funded project. So these are the sort of principles or the vision of what we have of a decentralized economy based on renewable energy, food production, solving immediate day-to-day problems, and generating income, contributing to the national grid as well. So we like this heading here, the call to empower citizens to become energy shareholders. And this looks like a bit like a privatization call. But if you think about the model that we've been putting forward, it's actually more like socialism than privatization. So it feeds into this whole debate, the sort of way in which the labor movement feel threatened by this idea of privatizing Eskom. And we are arguing that there's something in between privatization, which will benefit the big players, the people who are the capitalists, if you like. And there's something in between that and Eskom, which is state-centered, state ownership. And what it is ordinary working class people who can actually own the means of energy production. Yeah, so that's let me stop sharing. And then we can have some discussion about it.
Thank you very much, Janet, for that really interesting overview of the project and both the successes and the challenges. So we've got a good 30 minutes now for questions and discussions. So if anybody has any burning questions, or they don't even have to be burning, but any questions that they'd like or comments, please feel free to either raise your hands, or to, if you're struggling to do that, you can also try and jump off mute or put your name in the chat. I see first off we have Richard Worthington. Richard, over to you.
Hi, folks. Jan, thanks so much. I'm Richard Worthington. I work freelance, including doing voluntary work with Project 90 by 2030. And we're looking at ways to advance more provision of more electricity to more households. And it's not the first time that it's great to have you revive my enthusiasm for this project. It's something that one's been looking to for quite a while, and obviously very challenging. And I'm not optimistic about our new Minister of Electricity. But on the other hand, we haven't particularly tested what one might get from him other than the distraction he's providing for other ministers. But seeing this, I have to wonder whether there's been thoughts about pitching this to the new minister on the basis, not that I think he's going to wave a magic wand, but it's compelling stuff, and it needs to get to a wider audience. And if one was going to talk to him about anything, I think this might be a good place to come in by, rather than some of the more kind of big picture things that you were alluding to at the end there. Debates around ownership and how that overlaps with private-public debate. So, yeah, have you got any plans for pitching this to the likes of the new minister or others? And maybe also, if you think that with the involvement now with this Presidential Climate Commission study, which I realize is short-term, whether you think that's going to give traction to get the word out there. Thanks very much.
So I don't have a plan I haven't actually thought about pitching it to the new minister at all, but the PCC report, what we are going to do, what we tasked with doing, is to put forward a few models of what could work, like what would be viable. And this kind of model would be one of them. So that's where I envisage it will go in the next few months, as one of a number of models. So it's not the only thing that we are exploring in the research project.
I was just providing some acronym support for you there, Janet, in the chat. I see. No worries. The PCC, meaning the Presidential Climate Commission. And Jason, do you want to come in with the next question?
Thanks. Yes, and thank you, Janet. Sorry, I'm taking the invitation to a non-burning question, but I'm always interested in versions of commonses that have been present, or things that are adjacent to those in our context. So the non-burning question is, what's the etymology of gap tap? Because and I've never come across the term before.
Oh, okay. I don't know why it's not used. Where are you, Jason?
I'm right now. For the foreseeable, I'm in northern KZN. I'm in Zululand.
So I think it's used in these Kwazakhele townships for some reason. I'm not sure if it's used elsewhere, but it's from when Kwazakhele was set up as a site and service township in the 50s, and in between every 30 or so houses, there's an open space which is the equivalent of 4 stands, and there was a stand tap. So the stand tap was a water tap, and that serviced those houses before they had piped water. So they've now got piped water into the houses, but for decades they just had a stand tap. So it was called the gap tap. It's
the tap in the gap.
The gap where the tap was. Yeah. So it came from township
Thanks,
residents, and I don't know, it wasn't a municipal designation. Yeah. But people own those gap taps. So they have a sense of ownership. So they say, our gap tap, you know, we're going to do this on our gap tap, or come to our gap tap on Thursday.
I think it's really interesting that that you've built into that sense of I mean, it's a small common space, and that's really, really interesting. I mean, the other thing that comes to mind is old Town architecture was built, yard houses were built around common areas kind of thing, and they used urban blocks in a completely different way to suburban layouts in white suburbs. And so thanks, that really interests me, the idea of these slightly different, very localized versions of small commonses, and that's interesting that's there. I'll shut up about that and let substantive questions come in, but thanks for filling that in.
But let me can I add one thing on this, that we actually really worried that the municipality, when we discussed with them where this pilot project was situated, they said they're planning to sell some of these gap taps. So we said, no, like, this is crazy. I mean, the whole project is premised on this being public land, and they are zoned as public open space. That is the zoning. So now municipality is wanting to sell pieces of land to get money, to get revenue. And you can imagine the potential for corruption there.
I think something that came through with what you discussed already is the kind of Streisand effect worry that just by drawing attention to some of these options, it might lead to bureaucrats deciding it falls under their territory and they'll legislate it away. And I gather from your presentation that that's an ongoing tension. But hopefully, as you say, drawing attention to it cements the sense that that public land and that ownership can be reinscribed.
It is interesting. And what's also interesting is how the municipality has this publicly very positive relationship to this project, and bureaucratically a very negative relationship. So we're trying to negotiate between the two. What's interesting though is that they don't stop it, they don't want to interfere with it. So, because the ward councillor supports it, the residents support it, everybody wants to see it happening.
They just don't want to actually be involved in facilitating any of it either.
Yeah. And I don't know whether it's a lack of capacity or getting their heads around something new in a context where the municipality is already so fraught. It's really, really in trouble. So, I think the good people are afraid to step out of line or do anything that's outside of the normal procedures. So it's difficult. Innovation is very difficult in this context.
All right. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, very interesting to see how those common spaces are potentially privatized versus efforts to turn them into energy democracy spaces. I see Devon Pillay is up next on the stack. Devon.
Hi, guys. Thanks, Alex, and thanks, John. Excellent presentation, and I think it builds on what the discussion you and I have had previously on the project. The whole idea of cooperatives have been around for decades, and one of my struggle has been, and this goes back to late 1990s, early 2000, is that the cooperative movement has failed to capture the market and sorry, I'm not using the term market as in a pure capitalist sense, but in terms of their competitive edge. So, for example, the cooperative association in South Africa is made up of a number of sectors, and the financial sector for me was very important and interesting, in that many years ago they had several millions invested, or rather in bank accounts, and they simply allowed themselves to earn interest out of it rather than make that capital work for them. And that means basically working across the different sectors of the cooperative. So, for example, fund agricultural cooperatives, and then also fund housing cooperatives. And all of this would provided a good return to them, much higher than the banks were providing, and at the same time developing society. But let me not go in there. I mean, that's just one of the challenges that I find, and I'm still trying to grasp around that with Zach, etc., from the association. But what's interesting for me is this model that's been put together at Saltuba. So we've got the capital investment. I fully understand the challenges with the municipalities and the difficulties that you're experiencing. But what has been the thought around, you see, once you make a capital injection, it's very critical that you generate income from that in order to maintain that infrastructure at the very least. And when you're looking at PV and battery, these lifespans will be for battery up to 10 to 15 years, PV anything from 20 to 25 years. So at some point, this needs to be, capital needs to be replaced. So what is the thinking around how the co-op works around this? And for me, to a larger extent, what has been outside of the municipality, other thoughts around income generation for this particular co-op. Now, I raise this, Janet, because the issues you've raised about the challenges you're experiencing in the municipality is quite deep and quite strange on one end. I mean, you can't, I mean, a single institution itself can't seem to get itself working coherently across its different business units. And I've actually raised that internally. And, within the JET IP, there's something in the region of 300 million rand that's been kept aside for municipal capacity building. And I flagged this already as one of those things that we need to do is look through how do we capacitate municipalities to initiate such forms of ownership and tie this into what I consider to be public good. So if the municipality wants to sell the land because it needs the revenue, once it sells the land, it's lost that asset completely. Should it not be thinking of other forms of revenue? So for example, get the cooperative to be financially sustainable, work with the cooperative on that, and then lease the land out at a reasonable rate. So, that's kind of circular kind of thinking is very important when we build into this whole forms of social ownership. And to conclude, Alex, sorry, and for me, this is an extremely critical moment, because the just transition provides for us the opportunity to significantly transform our socio-economic environment. It's for the first time since 1994, I actually see where we are able to genuinely embed democracy and ownership in our economy. So, that's the view and posture that I kind of push wherever I can in terms of this whole just transition. And I think, these new forms of social ownership is going to bring that to reality. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Janet.
Thanks very much, Devin. Janet, do you want to come in for a response? If anybody else has questions, feel free to raise your hands for the next ones. Over to you, Janet.
Yeah, thanks, Devin. So, the issue about the lease of the land is an interesting one. And, I think because this is a pilot, our assumption was that we would just use the land. And the municipality has now said, no, if we want to not sell, but if we want to use the grid, then we need to, then Saltuba, the co-op, needs to have a municipal account. They haven't been able to get a municipal account because, why not? They don't own the land. Land is owned by the municipality. So we had long discussion with the municipality about this, and they were saying there were two options. The one option was that it's run as a municipal project under the Department of Energy and Agriculture and Economic Development. Sorry, I see Irina's making a point about this, but let's just come on to this. So they said, the one option was to have it run as a municipal project. So we tried to do that. We actually got a letter from the MMC for Agriculture and Economic Development saying this was a project that they supported, etc. But that wasn't enough for the municipality. Then they said, no, you must actually have you must apply for a lease for this. So the Saltuba Cooperative then applied for a lease, and it took, I think we had support from the councillor as well. They applied for they wanted what we assumed would be a free lease, what they call a free lease. And I think they applied in November last year, and it took 6 months before the Saltuba received a letter from the municipality saying that the application had been received, but that it has to now go for a technical review, after which time it will serve at the council, after which time it will be advertised, and there's no guarantee that the Saltuba will be able to purchase the property. So they used the term purchase. So we were saying, hang on. We thought this was a simple process of applying for a lease. So you see now, Irina has posted here saying in Walmer Township, there's an agricultural co-op that has negotiated a 99-year lease of the municipal land. Okay. So I've also heard of another case of a creche where a woman in one other township is using the land adjacent to her house to run a creche. And she says, oh, but the councillor just allowed her a free lease to use that land. However, I think in her case, she doesn't have a municipal account. And this seems to be the stumbling block here. So the municipality is saying you have to have a municipal account in order to get a smart meter. And the smart meter then enables you to have a two-way flow of electricity and so on into the grid. So we then discussed it. I mean, I don't want to get into, we've got a bit of time to get into detail about this, but we talked to a NERSA guy. So the NERSA guy says to us, no, actually, in order to wheel electricity through the municipal grid, you don't need a municipal account. Why do you need a municipal account? It's the buyer who needs a municipal account, and the buyer has to pay the wheeling tariff. So Saltuba shouldn't need this. It should be a non-issue. All you should need is for the councillor to say you can use the land, like they do with in many cases. The councillor just says it's fine, you can use this piece of land. It doesn't require it doesn't require a process in terms of the Municipal Finance Management Act that you put it out to tender and then you advertise whether anybody else wants to lease the land, etc. And we don't want to go the privatization route, which is that each of those gap taps is seen as an asset, which is then sold off to, speculators who want to come in and do development on them or whatever it is. That would completely undermine the objective of the project. So the lease issue is actually has to be resolved. This issue about whether a community can lease a piece of municipal land, and what is the process, what are the terms for that to happen. And then once that happens, they can get a municipal account. I mean, it gets more complex when you talk about combining rooftop solar. That, for example, in the model that we have, you could have each of 25 households having solar panels, plus you have a freestanding array. And then that gives you a bit of volume in terms of electricity that you feed in. Then you have to say, okay, well, what are people using in their households? And what do people want to use that solar array for? Is there anything left over to sell to the municipality or to the third party?
Sure.
So that's what we're trying to test, but we haven't got to the point of testing that yet. So
yeah,
really,
I think we can take the discussion further next week. But I think the point that I was raising, and sorry, Alex, to dominate, but my last comment is that even if you have created the structure and this infrastructure, and households are using it, then the households themselves that's actually using it should contribute something towards the cooperative that becomes its income. And it does not need to be surplus. That income is only provided for the maintenance and refurbishment or replacement of the infrastructure that's been put in. So, but I don't want to dominate the discussion. Let's take this and have a further discussion next week, because I can see some of the challenges that you're experiencing. We can assist to unblock. Thanks, Janet, and thanks, Alex, and to everyone that's on the Zoom call.
Well, it relates to the question that's on the chat about from Ferran about community ownership and participation and how the community manages the project, and has there been any training or support. So it relates to this question of whether they are generating any income and who is doing the maintenance, who is paying for it, who's contributing to it. And at the moment, it's a big problem, because the only revenue they've been able to generate is a very, very small amount through the sale of vegetables in the neighborhood, and a bit of sale of waste like cardboard and plastic bottles and so on, to waste trading. So there's been no income from the energy generation. There's an idea of having a little internet cafe. So we'd have a little router and Wi-Fi, etc. But of course, we have not succeeded so far in getting support from the internet service providers. But anyway, that's a bit of another debate. So basically, the capital cost has been borne by our funders that we got funding from Iscia Trust for the installation, which went via the Nelson Mandela University Trust. And it's part of the problem is that because it's not producing any steady income from the electricity sale, which was the expectation, that the residents who are members of the co-op are not motivated to work, to make it work. So they're struggling to, there's some people who do vegetable gardening and so on, but the premise of the electricity is that what the residents do is look after the facility. So they basically protect it, provide some form of security, which they actually did pretty well until we put in the lithium-ion battery last year in December, because that's then a valuable resaleable item. And within 2 weeks, it was stolen on Christmas Day. Anyway, I don't want to go into the problems, but so we are addressing these issues about security and so on. But because it is within a residential neighborhood, there is a way in which people can look after that facility themselves. So that's really the extent of ownership and participation at the moment. We had some training in the sort of business model with CIPSET, which is our Center for Post-School Education and Training here, with Irina Zenekal. I think she wasn't able. Oh, she is here. Irina is here. Irina can talk about it. Yeah, it's not been an easy process. Are there any other questions?
I see one hand just came up from Anita.
Hi, Janet. Anita here. Thanks for your presentation. It's really good to see this laid out. Quick question. My understanding is that there isn't currently any kind of framework sort of mechanism for rooftop solar to feed into the grid. Am I right there? That's the first question. And that for me, it seems like the big barrier to anything being scaled up. But the bigger question that's related to that is that as this mechanism framework is being developed, how do we make sure that it is a democratized, that it is basically not going to be sort of just leaning towards big corporations or mines feeding the grid, that actually front and center of the framework of the plan is this kind of very democratic kind of cooperatives feeding the grid, and that we don't end up with a framework that doesn't allow for this shift that we need.
Yeah, thanks, Anita. So the first question about rooftop solar feed-in is that this municipality was actually quite instrumental in putting in an innovative system some years ago, where you could put up rooftop solar on your house, and if you had a municipal account, you could feed in if you had a surplus, if you were using less than you were producing, and you could not get paid for it in cash, but it would come off your municipal bill. So you could keep your municipal bill in the black, basically. And that was quite good. It worked for quite a while. Unfortunately, the municipality's actually gone backwards in terms of the system. So it's no longer viable for people. So this is mainly like quite wealthy people who've put up solar arrays. But how it would work for poor households who are using ATTP and prepaid meters and so on is another matter. And I mean, that is the reason why we didn't test this on individual households, was because we didn't want to confuse this matter of, like, people saying, but we're getting X amount of free electricity and now we're having to pay for this amount, but we should be getting this amount from our solar panels and so on. It was, I mean, it's necessary to do that, but we just haven't quite got there yet. So we tested the other system first, which was the freestanding array. The second question about how it would be democratized. So this is really important. I mean, the structure of co-op legislation in South Africa provides for primary co-ops. So that neighborhood co-op is a primary co-op. And the idea would be that each primary co-op is democratic. It's its own management. Then they link into a secondary co-op. So let's say 50 gap taps in Kwazakhele, each has a solar array and household solar production and so on. They then come together into a secondary co-op. And then the tertiary co-op would be the one that then provides the facilities and support to all these co-ops, including investments and banking facilities and so on. I mean, we could even use, we had wonderful ideas. I mean, it was to use blockchain system for banking to get off the banks, off dependency on the banks. We had a partnership with a blockchain-based bank called For Us, which hasn't managed to get approval from the South African financial regulatory authorities yet. So the idea would be that the primary co-op is the democratic, the democratic model. So Richard says, let's not be afraid to call this a socialist model, which is great. Yeah, I'm happy with that. If you want to, I mean, I suppose it depends on the audience you're talking to, whether you talk about socialism or not.
Yeah, some might find it more palatable for energy democracy, but yeah, it depends on which room you're in here.
Yep.
Thanks so much, Janet. That brings us to the top of the hour. I always hate to foreclose conversations before they're finished, but I know we're supposed to stick to an hour. Andrea, is there anything that you'd like to say before we maybe wrap up? Or I don't know if we can leave people in the Zoom room if they want to chat further and they can turn off the lights when they're done.
I think we'll chat again. Well, we won't be able to chat again next week, as I said, because we're going to take a break in the seminar series for our winter break and start again next semester. But I mean, this is not a conversation that is limited to our Zoom room. It goes out all over the place, and I think it will, hopefully stimulate, I don't know, conversations at least, but at least some kind of action. I was quite I don't know, my ears pricked up when Devan Pillay mentioned that he could, I'm not sure if I'm being right here, but that he could actually help resolve some of these issues. So I'm hoping that you will chat to him. Yeah, no, I think it is time for us to end off now. And as I said, we will restart this series after the July break. So Janet, thank you. It's really important work, and it's really frustrating because it does seem to be a regulatory and political will is not exactly there.
Yeah. Just to say, there's a question, but next week on Thursday, the 8th, there is a big workshop here at ETC, I think, Iscia Training Centre, which the PCC is running with Nelson Mandela Bay, looking at resilience for the whole metro. So it's not about this. It's not about this project. It's about the broader question about climate resilience. And they're going to visit the Saltuba project as part of that on the day before.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, right.
Great, thanks everybody.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thanks
Alex,
for your input.
and yes, I know, it's like you've left us on a very kind of I don't know, at least me, on a very frustrated note. But yeah, thanks for sharing, Janet. it's
Sure.
yeah.
We'll keep you in touch, keep you informed.
All right.
In the bigger picture, it's great news. It might be a somber place to end on, but given where we're at, it's great that this is happening, and all strength to you.
Oh, there we
Thank
go.
you,
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Yes, excellent. That's a much better note to end on. Okay, thanks everyone, and we will pick up again next semester. Okay.
Great. Bye.
Cheers.